Hi, this is Dan Heisman, and this is our series of videos to help the listener viewer play better chess. Today I thought I'd talk about the three main ways that someone can allow a tactic. And I know there's more than three, but I think these three cover the overwhelming majority of the cases. So let's start out with the way that grandmasters usually allow tactics, which is they get positionally outplayed, and eventually the opponent gets such a good position that tactics flow from the superior position. This is what Steinitz was talking about when he was talking about, outplaying the opponent and don't trying, for things that aren't there, but instead try to build up your position. So in general, when two really good players play, it's not so much that one player is better than the other and the other blunders and allows a tactic. It's that one builds up a good positional advantage in such a way that the opponent eventually something has to give. So I thought we'd try a couple of examples of that. Let's look at this Morphy-Paulsen game. Morphy plays e4, c5. I'm just going to go through the opening rather quickly. d4, c takes d4, knight f3, could be transposing into an open Sicilian, and it does. e6, knight takes d4, bishop c5. Today that's considered a little bit of an inferior move order. Probably better to play knight c6 first, like a Paulsen, or a6. Notice the Paulsen named after Paulsen, so he's trying these move orders. Eventually, the one named after him would be the one not quite with this move order. So Morphy says, which diagonal you want to go to, Mr. Bishop? And the bishop goes to b6, leaving this diagonal a little weak. Morphy plays knight c3. Paulsen plays knight e7. He doesn't want to play knight f6 and allow e5, so he plays knight e7. And here Morphy plays bishop f4, putting pressure on the d6 square. And the best way to fight that is to play d5. And even though when white takes back, white takes on d5 and black takes back, white's going to give black an isolated queen pawn. That's what Paulsen should do, and he wouldn't have a bad game. Instead, he doesn't want to get the isolated pawn, and he castles. And this allows Morphy to start to put the clamps on his position with bishop d6. So already Morphy is outplaying Paulsen, and he has a positional advantage. Paulsen feels like he has to strike out into the center with a move to try to get out of it, and he plays f5. Morphy correctly keeps the pressure on by playing e5. a6, bishop e2, knight c6, castle, rook f7, king h1, threatening f4 in some lines, so Paulsen stops that with his own f4. Morphy says, but that weakens the e4 square. I can put a knight there. Knight f5, trying to get rid of this bishop that's down his throat here. Bishop h5 hitting the rook. g6 creating more weak squares around the king, especially the f6 square. Bishop to g4. Knight g7. White plays queen f3. h5. Bishop h3. Queen h4. Morphy plays knight f6 check. King h8. Queen e4. So now what's happening is this g6 square is getting worse and worse. Black can't just push the pawn because he gets checkmated. But how's he going to save the pawn? It's becoming really difficult. So Paulsen plays queen g5. Morphy says, okay, I'm going to open up one of these lines with my break move g3. Paulsen plays f3 with the idea that if queen f3, maybe he can play something like knight e5. Morphy says, all right, I'll take the pawn, all right, but I'm going to take it with the knight and hit your queen. So now something has to give. Morphy is starting to win material. Paulsen tries to counterattack the knight on f6. Morphy says, thanks for the pawn. Paulsen plays queen h6. And Morphy plays rook g1. And, he's even thinking of now pushing the g-pawn. Paulsen takes the knight on f6. Morphy takes back. And now Paulsen plays knight to e8. If Paulsen plays rook 2 takes f6, computer says the best way to take advantage of that is to play bishop f4, after knight to e8, hitting the bishop and the pawn. Morphy hits the queen, and now black has completely fallen apart. If he plays queen f8, then queen takes g6. If queen h7, then knight g5 forks the queen and the rook. So Poulsen tries to counterattack the queen. Morphy takes the knight because he gets a whole queen at the end. Poulsen tries the same counting trick by taking the bishop, and then Morphy takes the bishop with check. Rook takes, pawn takes, and Morphy's up a piece and he wins. All right, let's look at another game where there's a positional advantage. Let's try number 332. Okay, examine. Okay. All right, Carrez and Winter from 1935. E4, C5, knight F3, knight F6. All right, the rare variation here. E5, knight D5, knight C3, E6, knight takes, pawn takes, D4, D6, bishop to G5. All right, so in this position, Winter should play queen B6, where white has a nice position. He plays queen A5 check instead. And Carrez plays C3. Winter here should play something like bishop E6. He plays C takes D4. And Carrez sees an opportunity now to just get way ahead in development. So he just plays bishop D3 and offers more pawns. The computer says the most accurate move was E6 there. Bishop D3, D takes C, and Carrez just castles. Now Carrez has his king developed, his knight, his bishop, and all Winter has out is his queen, but he's got a couple of pawns for his troubles. Stockfish suggests knight C6 is the best defense, but white's way better. Winter plays greedy and keeps taking the pawns. Here Stockfish suggests that Carrez should play queen C2, threatening the bishop on C8. Carrez plays rook A, B1. Winter says, I'll take another pawn on E5. Now Winter's got all 8 of his original pawns, and Carrez only has 4 of his. You don't see this very often where one side has 8 pawns and the other side has 4 after only 11 moves. All right, so Winter immediately, of course, gets recaptured on E5. So doesn't have all 8 of his pawns anymore. But he's up 3 pawns, but look at white's pieces are already menacingly around black's king. And Stockfish says black's lost no matter what. For instance, if he plays his best move, bishop E6, Stockfish says Carrez should play the simple rook takes B2, threatening B7, and black just can't complete his development. Instead, Winter is completely overwhelmed. He plays bishop D6, hitting the knight, and it's no wonder that Carrez has a combination now to win the game. Knight takes F7, best move. King takes F7. Queen H5 check. G6. Bishop takes G6. H takes G6. Queen takes H8. Stockfish says white's up by 11 pawns. Bishop F5. Rook B E1, best move. Getting another piece into the attack. Bishop E4, trying to stop it. Carrez says, I'll just get rid of your defender. Pawn takes. Queen F6 check, and Winter resigned. If he goes king to E8, then Queen E6 check. King F8, Bishop H6 checkmate. If he plays King G8, Queen checks, King F8, Queen checks, King F7, Queen checks. If he plays King G6, check, up, check, here, check, here,
checkmate.
Queen F6 mate. Okay, anyway, so these two games we see two famous attacking players, Carrez and Morphy, just getting it big positional advantage very quickly in the game, overwhelming their opponent and then getting a tactic. So that's the way a lot of grandmasters allow tactics, is they get a really bad position and the tactic is allowed. But at the amateur level, there's the two other ways are much more common. And one of those two ways is overlooking a threat. So I thought I would put in a game that I played against the 1700 where I created a nice subtle threat. Let me see if I can bring that one up. Hold on a second. Examine. Okay, so I was black. Let's flip the board. You can see it from my side. I was black and I was playing a 1700 player. I think at the time this game was played, I was probably an expert. So he plays the rare move b3. So I go right for the center with d5. And he plays bishop to b5. Now I need to castle, so I bring out my knight. He castles, and now he's going to threaten rook checks. So I play bishop e7. He plays knight e5, hitting my knight on c6. I guard it with the queen. Puts the rook on the file. I block the file with the bishop. I could have just castled there. I think Stockfish says that's a little better. He plays bishop b2. I castle. He takes my knight. I take back. B takes c6. He plays queen f3. I think the computer there like bishop d6, skewering the knight to the h2 pawn. I play rook fe8. He plays knight e2. I play d4 to block the bishop. Maybe not my best move, but it's okay. He plays knight f4 to allow the rook to guard the knight. I play bishop d5, giving up the bishop pair, but getting a good centralized set of pawns. He plays c3, lets me undouble the pawns. I have a slight advantage. I take. Takes with the queen, leaving his pawn isolated. That does unblock the bishop, but allows me to play d4. The good news on d4 is it blocks the diagonal. The bad news on d4 is it makes my c-pawn a little backward. So he plays queen to h3. And I play bishop f8 to hit the knight again with the rook. He brings the knight back. I bring my queen to f4. And my opponent, who's lower rated, would be happy with the draw. He offers the trade of queens with queen to h4. All right, so I don't want to trade queens. I play queen f5. He decides to attack my backward pawn with bishop to a3. And so now I realize that I'm getting some good space on the king side. So I play h6, which looks fairly innocuous. And my opponent plays rook on e to c1, figuring he's going to pile up on this pawn, which I only have guarded twice here. So now I realized that my opponent was in a little bit of trouble. And I also realized I had a nice move that my opponent would probably completely overlook. So I played rook on a to c8. Now, when somebody plays rook fc1 and you play rook a c8, they're going to think 100% that the only thing that really does is overprotect the pawn so that when he starts piling up on that pawn, I'll have enough defenders. So sure enough, my opponent starts piling up with rook to c4, intending rook on 1 to c1, and I completely surprise him with the move g4, g5. So now his queen only has two safe squares, g3 and h3. If he plays queen h3, I have g4, forking the queen and the knight with the pawn. In the game, he plays queen g3. But now I finish playing my purpose of the move rook a c8. I play knight to e4. And the queen can't go to that c7 square. That's why I moved the rook over there, was to threaten g5 so that I would win a piece. And, you know, it's understandable my opponent missed the threat. It doesn't look like rook a c8 is threatening to win a piece. So here, my opponent understandably missed the idea. I made a threat. My threat is to play g5. Now, what could he have done about the threat? Well, let's see. Stockfish says he could have played queen h3 right away. And it says I'm winning if I play queen d3, but I'm not winning a piece. So he had to do something like that. Of course, most people don't want to play queen h3 because they're afraid they'll isolate all their pawns on one side of the board, and that would be bad. But unfortunately for him, I'm threatening to win the piece. And after I played g5, for instance, if he plays queen h3, I play g4. If he counterattacks me with knight h4, then I simply move my queen and attack his knight. If he tries to guard the knight, I remove the guard. And again, I'm going to win a piece. So after I played knight to e4, now he played queen h3. Now I forked him. He counterattacked my queen. I said check, queen takes f2 check. And now he resigned because I'm going to take his queen on the next move. Okay, so that's a good example. The second way to lose material or fall into a tactic is to not see the threat. And we could go through like every trap that there is where there's threats. For instance, let's look at the Caro-Kann. All right, there's a famous trap in the Caro-Kann. d4, knight c3, d takes e, knight takes e4, knight d7, queen e2. So white has a threat. He's threatening knight d6 with a smothered mate thanks to the sneaky pin. So the people that fall into the trap usually play knight on g to f6, and then they're surprised by knight d6 checkmate because they missed the threat. But let's say black plays a different move order. Let's say black plays knight f6 first, and white plays queen to e2. So white's offering a sacrifice. He says, you can take my pawn. And of course, black should take the pawn. Queen e2 is a terrible move. But let's say here, does white have any threats? And the answer is, white has absolutely no threats. How do you know he has no threats? Because suppose we make it white's move. Suppose black says, I pass. Or he makes a very innocuous move. He plays a6 or something. Well, white doesn't have anything wonderful here. He could play knight takes f6 check, and black has to take back with the g-pawn. And you could say, well, that's not my favorite pawn structure, so that's maybe a mild positional threat. But he doesn't have any tactical threats. So if black allows knight takes f6, that's not good, but it's not a tactic. So here, in a sense, white has no threats. But suppose black now does the third way of losing material or falling into a tactic, where he makes an unsafe move. He plays knight bd7. White didn't have any threats before. Knight d6 was not a threat because the queen could just take it. But now that black has removed his own guard on d6, white has that same checkmate. Knight d6 checkmate, even though white's previous move had no threats. So that's the third way you can make a mistake. The three big ways to fall into tactic are: one, to get positionally outplayed to the point where your position falls apart and your opponent gets a tactic. That's the most common at the Grandmaster level, and that's the way most Grandmaster tactics are played. The second is to overlook a threat. Your opponent makes a threat, you don't realize it's a threat, you make a move, and he goes boom, and he executes that threat because you missed it, and you give him a tactic that way. That's very common at the amateur level. The final way is to actually make a move that's not safe when your opponent is not really threatening anything, but you make unsafe moves. And of course, we could show this all day. I mean, pretty much any time you put a piece on prise where your opponent wasn't threatening anything, that's going to be that type of error. So obviously here, if white plays a ridiculous move like queen to g4, that's falling into the tactic by making an unsafe move. Black has this pleasant choice of all these different ways to take the queen. And in amateur games, you see both missing threats and places where they're just making unsafe moves. Let's look at a couple of them. Let's say white plays e4, e6, d4, d5, bishop d3, knight f6, e5. Okay, well, white has a threat. E takes f6. If black doesn't move the knight and he plays some random move, a6, that's missing the threat, and then he gets his knight taken off. But I've seen beginners here say, I'm going to show you, I don't have to move the knight. I'll play a forcing counterattacking move instead. And they play bishop b4 check. Now, they see the threat to their knight. They just think that they're getting a free developing move in instead. And, of course, white now plays c3. And then all of a sudden, black goes, uh-oh, he's got two of my pieces attacked. So this is not a case of overlooking the threat. This is a case of making an unsafe move. Bishop to b4 check is unsafe because after c3, white's threatening two different pieces and black can't save both of them. So that's an example of making an unsafe move. All right, let's do another example that I've shown for one of my students' games. My student was black, and after d4, d5, c3, knight c6, knight f3, he played bishop f5, and now white played c takes d5. All right, so white has taken a pawn, and black needs to recapture. He should play queen takes d5. Now, queen takes d5 is not a very good opening for black, because after white plays knight c3, if black plays something like queen to a5, the computer says white's actually winning after bishop d2 with all kinds of threats, plus 3.7. But still, black should take the pawn and see if white can figure this kind of stuff out. Instead, black says, well, I see that you're threatening my knight, and I see that I could take the pawn, but I see a tactic down here. I can threaten you and play a tactic. So here, black does not ignore the threat to take off his knight, but he plays knight to b4. And black played this move pretty quickly, and he didn't calculate whether white could stop him with a move like knight a3, but of course white is even better than that, because knight b4 is not safe. Instead, his opponent wisely played queen a4 check, and now he's double attacking the knight and the king, and it's too late to come back with the knight because that pawn that he didn't take off will take off the knight. So no matter how he gets out of check, let's say bishop d7, queen takes b4, he loses a knight. So this is an example of he sees the threat, he has a way to stop it even though this is not a good opening for black by any stretch of the imagination. And instead he makes an unsafe move, figuring he's the one making a threat. He told me after the game the only thing I could see in this position was that I was threatening knight c2 and checking him. I didn't look to see how he could stop it. I didn't look at his checks, captures, and threats. I didn't look at his defenses. I just wanted to threaten that fork. Well, okay, if you're playing a speed game and you want to play that way, that's okay. But if you want to be a good player, and of course I assume that almost every single person taking lessons from me is trying to become a better player, that's not the way you want to play chess. You don't want to, just make quick moves and see what will happen. In that sense, it's the worst form of hope chess that we can get here. Okay, so we could go on and on and on. Almost every single tactic that can occur. I mean, if we come up with any kind of trap in the opening, let's try, let's say Petrov's trap. e4, e5, knight f3, knight f6, knight takes e5. Okay, black's supposed to play d6, knight f3, and then take the pawn. But if black takes the pawn, it's not that white had a threat. White wasn't threatening anything. If black attacks the knight, he's just going to save it. Black's going to get the pawn back, and it'll be even. So white's not threatening anything, but after he plays knight takes e4, it's not safe. It's allowing this attack on the knight with a potential discovered attack. That's the way black's falling into the tactic. He's making an unsafe move. So a lot of these kind of opening traps fall into that category. The best he could do is play like queen to e7, queen takes, d6, knight's pinned, white would guard the knight, and eventually white's going to win a pawn here, as black will get his piece back, but white will capture back with a pawn, and white will end up winning that extra pawn. For instance, if black takes right away, white will take with the pawn. He could even take with the queen, and he's up a pawn. So those are the three ways. So let's review them again. The three main ways that you can fall into a tactic are: one, get positionally outplayed so that your position collapses and something has to give. Two, your opponent makes a threat and you don't see it or you don't react to it the right way, even if you see it, and he's able to execute the threat. That's a tactic. He could also make a threat that you can't meet, in which case your previous move was unsafe. And the final way of allowing a tactic is to simply make an unsafe move, and then your opponent takes advantage of it and wins material. So when you see these Grandmaster games where they squeeze people and then they get these tactics, their opponent isn't necessarily, overlooking threats or making unsafe moves. Their position just collapses. But at the lower level, you want to make sure that you don't fall for the other two. You don't want to make unsafe moves. That's why I wrote my book, Is Your Move Safe? And you don't want to miss threats. And I wrote another book called Looking for Trouble, which is what are the threats and how should you deal with them. So you don't want to allow threats to be executed. You want to see your opponent's threats. You want to make good replies to them. And you want to make sure your moves are safe. You don't just make moves and then when your opponent plays a check, capture, or threat, say to yourself, uh-oh, what do I do now? That means you've been playing hope chess. Hope chess means you make a move, and when your opponent makes a check, capture, or threat, you say to yourself, uh-oh, I hope I can meet this. And of course, a lot of times you can. It's too late. Whatever he's doing to you is unstoppable. Okay, hopefully this will help you play chess a little bit better. If you liked the video, hit the like button. If you'd like to subscribe to the channel, we'd love to get you as a subscriber as well. We're just about to get to our 100th video. I am going to give out a free lesson to a random subscriber to my channel. I think this is video number 97 maybe. So when we get to 100, we're going to run the contest. So hopefully if you're a subscriber, you can take place to the contest. Thanks a lot for tuning in, and we'll see you next time. Thanks. Bye.